It was difficult for me to imagine this city in peacetime, with people in the streets, with the sidewalk cafes full, and the aroma of grilled cevapcici in the air. The last time I was in Sarajevo, 17 years ago, it was a war zone. I arrived in the Bosnian capital for the first time in July 1993. The siege was in its 15th month, and the city was under constant sniper and mortar fire. The first thing I saw was a note that somebody had written on the UN container in the airport. June 18, 1993. The ceasefire lasted 13 seconds. Sarajevo is a narrow strip of flat land surrounded by mountains. On these mountains, the Bosnian Serb army, under the leadership of General Mladic and the self-styled President Radovan Karadzic. In the city below, some 300,000 people as constant targets. Tall buildings had become skeletons. There was no running water, no electricity, no heating, and very little food. Virtually everyone I met complained of losing weight from 25 to 30 pounds. United Nations troops distributed water. I was told they also distributed coffins for Christians. Coffins in Sarajevo by the 15th month of the siege were in short supply. Many streets carried the same name, Sniper's Alley, and one had to learn how to walk through the city under the siege. You had to run through the crossroads and to avoid streets perpendicular to the mountains. They were exposed to snipers. The same rule applied to all the windows from which you could see the mountains, and you could see mountains practically from every window, as well as from nearly every hole in the roof that resulted from shelling. By the 15th month of the siege, the Bosnian Serbs realized that artillery destroys buildings only. By that time, they had already burned down the National Library with hundreds of volumes of medieval manuscripts and incunabula. Mortar fire, on the other hand, resulted in more human casualties. Mortar bombs were dropped vertically. The perimeter buildings of the city do not protect people from such an assault. Their walls don't absorb the explosions. The bombs fell between the walls, even into the narrowest streets. We came to a backyard several hours after a mortar bomb killed 7 children. The blood on the pavement had already been washed away with precious water. Later in the morgue, the father of one of the victims, standing next to what was left from his son, shouted at me, "Now, do you admire what your Yeltsin did?" I did not publish this photo then. I will not do it now. There are images that journalists keep for themselves. Men in the neighboring backyard were preparing a child's grave. There was not enough space in the cemeteries. The Olympic Stadium had been turned into a graveyard, but it was exposed to snipers and permanently shelled by Serbs. A grim joke made the rounds at the time. I hope you come back from the cemetery alive. Some 11,000 people were killed in this city. I remember noticing that women tended to use rather bright makeup. A sniper would look through the crosshair and think, "What a beautiful girl, I won't shoot her," I was told. What was also striking was that people from the suburbs were forced to leave their houses so suddenly that they had left their laundry hanging in the yards. It was still drying in the sun, 15 months later, turning into rags. Officially, the siege began on May 3, 1992. A day before, the Yugoslav People's Army captured Bosnia-Herzegovina's leader, Alija Izetbegović. Bosnia had already declared its independence from Yugoslavia, and neighboring Croatia, which had split from Yugoslavia earlier, had been at war for 10 months. The UN representative, Canadian General Lewis Mackenzie, managed to negotiate the release of the Bosnian leader. But the armored personnel carrier transporting Izetbegović and Milutin Kukanec, the Yugoslav army commander in Sarajevo, came under fire.
U razgovoru sam sa predsjednikom. Njemu je odobreno da se odvoji sa Skenderije I da ide u predsjedništvo. Ostali moraju proći iz kolone.
General Jovan Divjak, a Serb, was responsible for the defense of Sarajevo against the army of Bosnian Serbs. Who fired at the Yugoslav army column that was leaving the city?
There is not enough courage to name those responsible in this country. But one should look for the reason for what happened on Dobrovoljica Street, not in the events of May 3, 1992, but long before that. The first conflict in Bosnia-Herzegovina started in October 1991 with the attack on the village Ravno in Herzegovina. Then Brečko in March 1992, Zvornik in April, valley of the river Drina. All of this was in preparation for what happened in Sarajevo. I can say that the first attack of Serbian military on Sarajevo took place on April 4. A group of Serbian military seized an Interior Ministry training center and arrested 160 cadets. This happened right after the referendum on independence, and the war itself started in the early morning on May 2, when the Yugoslav army launched the preliminary bombardment of the city and then put tanks and armored personnel carriers in front of the presidential palace in Skenderia.
Why did the Yugoslav army carry out this provocation and then leave the city to the Bosnian Serb army, which gave rise to this military orgy, this siege that lasted 1,425 days?
We never found out what the Yugoslav army wanted to achieve with all this. We were told they wanted to save the soldiers who were still in the city. Why was it done like this? This was the mistake of the Belgrade commanders of the Second Army Corps. We don't know the details. We don't know who drew up this plan for a troop withdrawal. But the army convoy came under attack, and this should be prosecuted. They should find those guilty and prosecute them. Why is this still not done? It's a problem of political will.
When somebody started to shoot at Commander's APC on Dobrovoljica Street, General Divjak shouted, "Don't shoot!" We are standing with the general on this very street, this very place where all this happened. When Serbs show the tape now, they edit out the word "don't" and leave the word "shoot," as if I had just shouted, "Shoot," Divjak tells me. Recently he was briefly detained in Vienna on a Serbian arrest warrant. An Austrian court found charges against him groundless.
I insist that these 2 days, May 2nd and 3rd, 1992, should be investigated. Speaking about May 3, it was the Serb commander, General Kukanic, who said that there were 7 dead. He said it on May 3, but the nationalists do not agree with him. Nationalists even blame him and say that he should have been at the end of the convoy and not in the first armored personnel carrier. Nationalists do not want to accept the truth.
But the truth was the siege. The truth was that according to the UNHCR norms, each person locked in the city was supposed to get about 1 pound of bread per day. In reality, they got 1.2 ounces. When I was there for the first time in '93, the only working bakery in the city was forced to close. There was some flour, but there was no electricity and no fuel for the generator. The authorities tried to save what was left of the fuel for the hospital. So people started to get flour instead of bread. And what can one do with flour if there is no water and no fire to bake bread? What else was in the UN ration? Pasta, beans, rice. Everything requires water and boiling. "Welcome to the Sarajevo concentration camp. The keys to it are kept by a Christian, Copt Boutros Boutros-Ghali from Egypt, the UN Secretary General," said the spiritual leader of Bosnian Muslims, Reisul Ulema Mustafa Ceric, greeting us in 1993. "Do you remember Cain?" he added. "God marked us in the same way. Our diverse world is being destroyed in the name of Orthodox religion." In Sarajevo, they didn't say at that time, "Let's do it tomorrow" or "See you tonight." There was no notion of tomorrow, no notion of tonight or in an hour or in a minute. There was only now and at this very moment, while being alive. I have returned to Sarajevo. I was trying to find the backyard where 7 children were killed in 1993. But there are hundreds of backyards just like this. It was the first time that I went up those mountains where the Bosnian Serb army had its position during the war. It was here that the Russian poet and current opposition leader and self-proclaimed presidential candidate Eduard Limonov tested a new machine gun at the invitation of Radovan Karadzic. This videotape from the documentary film Serbian Epic was presented at the International Tribunal in The Hague as evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Before all this, Sarajevo had been a multi-ethnic city. During the siege, I spoke with Bosnian Serb Borislav Gerak, convicted by a Sarajevo court to death penalty for rape and murder of almost 4 dozen of civilians. His father stayed in Sarajevo during the war. I asked him, "Did you ever think about the fact that any of the snipers on the mountains could kill your father?" "I didn't think about it," he replied.
Il y a 5-10 ans, c'est pas juste, que les Serbes insistaient.
5 years ago, Serbs started to insist on forming a special commission to find out the number of Serbs killed in Sarajevo during the war. At that time, it was impossible to form such a body. 3 years ago, we managed to put together a commission comprised of Serbs, Bosniaks, Croats, to find out how many people died in Sarajevo. Not only Serbs, but all nationalities. The Serbs agreed, but at the first meeting, Bosniaks demanded that it include in its agenda the damage to the city. They claimed it was 14 billion euro. The Serbs refused. And as they refused, propaganda started once again. The president of the Association of Relatives of Serbs killed in Sarajevo, who live in Banja Luka, insists now that there were 10,000 Serbs killed in Sarajevo. But I was here during the war. I know that during all those years, there were about 750 Serbs killed in Sarajevo, and international judges support my estimate. They also think that during the siege, there were about 750 Serbs killed in Sarajevo. And some of them were killed not because they were Serbs, but because they were Sarajevans. They were killed by Serbian snipers on the mountains. Among the tens of thousands of victims, there were 750 Serb civilians. This is why I insist that this case should be decided in court. On the other hand, we should put together a regional commission comprised of Croatia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Serbia, as they did in South Africa and in Central America. This is the only way how we can solve all these problems with victims, with war crimes, and the rest. You ask me, why is this not done? I don't know.
Et vous me demandez pourquoi non? Je sais pas. Pourquoi non? Je sais pas.
In 1993, in the 15th month of the siege, I wrote, "If anybody thinks that this city can survive, it's utopian. Even if the siege is lifted, Sarajevans would not be able to live through the wounds inflicted during this month of blockade. Sarajevo kids cannot sleep if there is no shooting at night." But the city was struggling to survive. At the end of 1992, the headquarters of the Sarajevo defense decided to dig a tunnel under the airport, which was the narrowest line of the siege separating the city from the free territory of Bosnia. In this free territory, the tunnel started near the house of Aliya and Shida Kolar, their son Bayra, and their grandsons Edis and Emin. The tunnel was dug by hand. It was high and wide enough to let one person through. At first, food and ammunition was delivered to the city in wheelbarrows. Back from the city, the military moved out the critically wounded the same way, also in wheelbarrows. Then rails were laid to accommodate one small trolley. Later, they installed a pipe, or better to say, a thick hose, and started to pump oil into the city. The oil was pumped from the free territory during the night. The entrance to the tunnel was permanently under fire. Overall, the Bosnian Serb army fired over 10,000 shells into this area. One hit a line of people at the entrance. Later, the government of Germany gave the city a gift, a special electric wire that provided Sarajevo with at least a bit of electricity. Then, a telephone cable that connected the city with the rest of the world. And all this happened under dire conditions, with the tunnel being constantly flooded. And when it was flooded, everything stopped, and a group of engineers would pump out the water, standing under the high-voltage wire. Now the entrance to the tunnel and the Kolar's family house are a museum. We met a group of students from Croatia there. I noticed that the grandson Edis started his story of the tunnel with a description of the siege. The teenagers were from the post-war generation. For them, this is already history. While the tour went on, Edis's father Bayra told me that they also had tourists from Serbia, mostly families, but not organized groups. We are standing with Bayra near his house. The visitors continue to come. The conversation is interrupted by wasps, quite a nuisance in autumn. And such are Serbs, like wasps, says one of the visitors suddenly. And there was an awkward pause. This note the U.S. diplomat Ambassador Richard Holbrooke left in the museum's guest book. Ambassador Holbrooke was one of the architects of the 1995 Dayton Peace Agreement, which marked its 16th anniversary last December. The Dayton Accords, reached in November 1995 on the military base in Dayton, Ohio, and signed on December 14th in Paris, put an end to the siege of Sarajevo, the longest siege in modern history. There is no front line anymore. But there is a split between nationalities and religions. So what is not working in this peace agreement guaranteed by the major powers? For more than a year, the parties of Bosnia-Herzegovina could not form the national government. When I met the president of Republika Srpska, Milorad Dodik, in Banja Luka and asked him why, he gave me the following explanation.
You have arrived in a country that was not created by the will of the people who live here, but by the will of the international community. The Dayton agreements were concluded for a number of reasons. Someone wanted something, someone else signed the agreement under duress. It would take a whole broadcast to explain this to your audience. I would just say this briefly. The situation regarding the selection of a Council of Ministers reflects the situation in the country as a whole, in Bosnia-Herzegovina. It is a fact that the peoples living in Bosnia never expressed the desire to live in that country. It is also a fact that one of those nations wants to impose its will, demonstrate its will as a majority, over the other two nations that do not want to live under such conditions. You can reduce the problem of the Council of Ministers to the level of ministerial posts and who will have what chair. But in this case, the inability to select an executive branch is typical, and it is directly connected to the conception of the construction of Bosnia-Herzegovina.
This interview prompted a letter of protest from Bakir Izetbegovic, the leader of Bosnian Muslims, or Bosniaks, and a member of the Bosnia-Herzegovina presidency. I asked my colleagues in Sarajevo to clarify what exactly provoked his outrage.
This time it is a statement that Bosniaks as a nation existed only starting from 1993 and that they are nowhere except for Bosnia-Herzegovina and that they cannot build their national identity other than by destroying identity of others. He says this about people who live through ethnic cleansing in that part of the country that Mr. Dodik represents, who lived through the genocide in Srebrenica where mosques were destroyed by Serb army. He tells these people they build their national identity through destroying the identity of others. It does not make sense and is groundless. I think that Mr. Dodik, through his rhetoric and politics, has stopped the positive process in Bosnia-Herzegovina, reconciliation and European integration. His politics cause tension in Bosnia-Herzegovina and can lead to serious conflicts. At the moment, due to his politics, we are running low on investment. Capital does not come into the countries with such an atmosphere that we now have in Bosnia-Herzegovina.
I was shocked to see how little this country had moved from the war over these 16 years of peace. In fact, the ethnic division finally took place here. Before the war, they used to call Sarajevo the Jerusalem of Europe. Well, now it's even more of a European Jerusalem. Now there is East Sarajevo, a new city where Serbs from Sarajevo moved over those years. There is no wall between the parts, not yet anyway, but there is no public transportation either. So why? What went wrong? Maybe this is the answer.
Because nothing is moving forward. Everything is either blocked or it's worse. It's worse and worse. Like we expected better politicians to come with new elections. We expected even new parties to take over. Even when they did, they started to behave the same way as those nationalistic parties, that they remain. That's one of the mistakes. Those who produced, basically, political forces that produced all the troubles in 90s, they were kept. International community intervened in many areas, but they never intervened in that area. Because you have, main three parties that were national parties, that were responsible for everything going on in this country in 90s, they are ruling up to now. But I think internationals were supposed to forbid these parties, particularly because the leaders of those parties, some of those parties, are all in The Hague. So you have policy that is condemned by everybody, by people, by internationals, and a party that is still ruling, which is strange. You can't expect any improvement from that.
Yes, Bosnia-Herzegovina is the only country in Europe that is organized according to the provisions of a peace agreement. And yes, the people in the one very much centralized part of it, Republika Srpska, understand this.
The Serbian strategy in Bosnia-Herzegovina should be based on one fact, and I keep repeating this. The only new feature after the breakup of Yugoslavia, the only new territorial and administrative entity, is Republika Srpska. There are no other new entities. Even Kosovo existed as an autonomous region. The rest were republics in former Yugoslavia. Republika Srpska is the only serious news after the Second World War, and we should not play around with it. We cannot get everything we want in one historic period. Can we get it in another era? Nobody can answer this now. There are fortune tellers that say that it's possible, but I'm not the one. I don't know what will happen in 30 or 50 years, but I know for sure that, at the moment, Serbs in Bosnia-Herzegovina have one thing that nobody else in former Yugoslavia has: a new status. And this is regardless of all the problems that accompanied Serbs during the wars in former Yugoslavia. We have enough internationally recognized self-governance inside Bosnia-Herzegovina. 49% of the territory, legislative, executive, and judicial powers, huge inner autonomy, practically a state within a state. We have all the mechanisms to protect our ethnic interests through the parliament, the council of ministers, and the presidency of Bosnia-Herzegovina. No decision can be taken without the Serbs. What else can we wish for?
And what gave all this to only one ethnic group in Bosnia and Herzegovina? The Dayton Peace Agreement, Annex 4, the constitution of the country that these three ethnic and religious groups never voted for.
I think Dayton Annex number 4 made horrible mess in this country. And it is, and of course, totally centralized entity. In fact, people, governing people in it, they grabbed it. They realized they were, first of all, in Dayton, those that were very much against peace agreement and everything in it was Republic Srpska, politicians from there. And I think without Milosevic in Serbia, they would refuse it. Milosevic was clever enough to say, you have to accept it. And besides, he was in charge. He had to sign. So he accepted it. He was really clever. But these other guys, they would again, it was just night before, I think, Americans would otherwise gave up. Later, they realized how good it is for them, and they grabbed it. And they grabbed just that part. All other annexes were not important. So majority of for life crucial annexes were never implemented. Like this energy sector and agreements regarding these big state corporations, this part about state property, refugee return, nothing was implemented. They were just careful that Annex 4 is implemented. That means Dayton Peace Agreement. And they now are stuck to that. They just say Dayton and nothing else. And that's a big problem, because they can certainly block any change of constitution. Now when we have this decision in the court in Strasbourg, they say only that should be changed, nothing else. And these other guys who realize that they cannot live in such a country, they say, of course, if we already start changing constitution because of human rights of minorities and others, we should change something else. We should at least change those things that are leading us towards Europe. So we can't cooperate with European Union without having, for instance, Ministry for Agriculture.
I came to a country that somehow managed to preserve the peace 16 years after the war. The charming city of Sarajevo, where the street lights are on when the muezzin finish their evening call for prayers, and an army of homeless cats go out on a night hunt. 90% of them are black. The ceasefire lasted.
I think that the situation today is very difficult. Sarajevo was a European and world example of a multinational city where all the people and representatives of all religions spoke the same language. But today we're really split. Sarajevo is divided into two parts. One part belongs to Republika Srpska. There are about 80,000 Serbs that live there and don't want to have any contacts with Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia. It's rare that students from East Sarajevo come to study in Sarajevo University. They prefer to study in Banja Luka or Belgrade. We have one female student from East Sarajevo. At the beginning, she had difficulties both here and at home. Everybody asked her, "Why are you studying here and not in Belgrade or Banja Luka?" Before the war, there were 50% Bosniaks, 33% Serbs, 12% Croats, and 5% other nationalities in the city. Today, it's 90% Bosniaks. The same problem is in Banja Luka. Before the war, there were 50% Serbs and 40% Bosniaks. Now, it's 95% Serbs. The same in Mostar. They say that Sarajevo is the capital of Bosnia, but the majority of Serbs do not recognize it as their capital. Milorad Dodik, president of Republika Srpska, likes to repeat, "Sarajevo is not my capital. My capital is Belgrade. Serbia first, and then all the rest." It's a mirror of 1993. Everything is the same, but the split is deeper.